Welcome back to our series on Christian chronology. This is the first part of the final installment in which I'm going to discuss everything end times. I'm going to be explaining the motives for the Antichrist and the people who will come to worship him, as well as all of the events that lead up to and include his reign. Most people think they know about the Antichrist, but fail to account for the whole world's knowledge of God's existence, and so remain woefully unprepared for what kinds of temptations are set to befall the human race. Ultimately, it isn't about the progression of technology, a fake alien invasion, or some kind of Christian heresy. What will unfold is a literal and conscious rebellion against the creator of the world as such, without reservation. You may think you're above being sucked into a movement like that, or that just about everyone you know would be above that. But let me explain, because this is serious business. All your life, you may have been conflating faith itself with the question of whether or not God exists, or possibly specialized knowledge of dogma. However, the modern question of God's existence and which church is the true church has nothing to do with the end of the world at all. In our previous videos, we recalculated the current year since creation, using the correct lifespans in Genesis, but keeping the rest of the logic in the Orthodox calendar. We arrive at the current year being 5,955. Today, it's extremely common among Orthodox elders to have the sense that we're actually in the end of days. They don't make any claims to knowing the date or the hour, but in my video I explain that it's no coincidence that this sentiment has arisen suspiciously close to our arrival at the year 6000. I dig up a few details about this tradition regarding millennial turnings, and investigate what the whole idea was back when this chronology was mainstream Orthodox eschatology. We learned that the Earth exists for 3 ages of 2,000 years each. Moreover, a pattern emerges that shows almost every important event in church history being directly parallel with corresponding events in the previous 2 ages. This model anticipates an event that doesn't mark the end of the world, but brings an end to the season of God's hiddenness from creation. In other words, before worrying about the Antichrist, we should be anticipating a return to public divine intervention. It should be mentioned that, for entirely different reasons, Orthodox elders in our time have come to that same conclusion. Based on our analysis of Isaiah's oracle of Egypt, we predict that in or around 2030, the salvation of the Jews will occur with the arrival of Elijah the prophet coming down from heaven. This very well could be coincident with a global earthquake and a public sign of Christ in heaven visible to the entire world, aka the 6th seal of Revelation and the sign of the coming of the Son of Man. Regardless of exactly which elements we put total confidence in, more or less, the world at that time will have perfect knowledge of God, and also some 40-odd years until the Antichrist at full strength. If orthodoxy is the popular world religion, and everyone sees God's signs publicly, how in the world does this happen? It's perplexing, but I think I have an answer. Ready? Let's begin. Rebellion against God today has come to mean something entirely different than it did for most of human history. When we look at the actions of Adam in the garden, the earth before the flood, the Tower of Babel, and the system of pagan idolatry, We typically call these rebellions against God. However, in our modern day, we also call atheism, reckless living, and unintentional heterodoxy rebellion against God. Because our primary struggle in relatively recent times has been about faith in whether God exists or not, or in exactly which way God exists, we've lost touch with the more important question that actually motivated these great sins of antiquity. The events of the biblical story are not concerned at all with whether or not God exists, or even rival sects among those who wish to be his servants. Rather, they are concerned with whether this God, who does exist, is good. The struggles of paradise, the flood, the tower, and idol worship are all a war of faith between those who believe God is good and those who believe that God is not. I ended my previous video with that very curious question. I alluded to the idea that it had to do with a philosophy called Gnosticism. At the same time as saying it, I showed a graphic of various countries adopting Nazism. It's critically important that we understand this school of thought and how it relates to the aforementioned events in biblical history. Gnosticism holds the basic tenet that the God who created this physical world is a lesser deity who emanates from a source that is intentionally hidden from human beings. It reframes the God of this created order as partially ignorant and possibly malicious. Ignorant mostly of his own limitations, perhaps himself convinced that he is the true first principle, but nonetheless not actually all-knowing, all-powerful, or all-present. Without making things too complicated, there are other beings in the realm from which all being ultimately comes, outside of the prison of this material world. According to Gnosticism, we ourselves are a spark of that original divine realm, as all spiritual beings are, but are made to forget where we come from due to this Creator's decision to render us ignorant of that fact. I use Nazism as an icon of this because, according to the best analysis, the phenomenon of Nazism is the purest political expression of this religious belief in recent times. An explanation can be found on Tick History, linked below in the description, but I won't get into detail on that topic here. This Gnosticism is the only and ultimate question of humanity's struggle with faith. Nothing more, nothing less. Everything you observe within the events of human history is a dialogue about this question. Let us look at some of humanity's most consequential faith battles and see. In the Garden of Eden, man and woman are created in bodily form by the God who sculpted a physical world from formless chaos. These beings are in blissful ignorance, even unaware of their own nakedness. A subtle serpent comes along and suggests to them that the tree of divine knowledge will not cause them to die, but that instead they will come to be equal with the God who created them. In essence, the serpent is claiming that humanity is being deceived by their Creator through the threat of deadly force into remaining ignorant of their divine equality with God. The implication here is that this God of creation is not actually the ground and source of all being, but rather that he only wants to make us believe that he is. After humanity decides to see for themselves whether or not their Creator is actually the highest and true God, they become overwhelmed by the divine knowledge, whatever it actually was, and become afflicted with mental death. They become captive to all-consuming fear, and as a result, require a world of toil and hardship to keep their new mental illness from devouring them in psychosis. Our present bodily condition emerges, in which the less one suffers, the more the psychosis emerges. The more one suffers, the more the psychosis is kept at bay. The condition of fear, however, still causes us to avoid suffering whenever it isn't externally imposed upon us by circumstance, leading to a position of treading water between psychic survival and oblivion. In the period that preceded the flood, there was no question whether or not God existed. Adam only died shortly before Noah was born, and everyone was living for many hundreds of years. All of the Earth's population regarded the fall as an event that happened only one generation removed from living memory, 2 at most. The flood isn't a story of a people who forgot God, or were somehow confused about what His will was. They were a generation who willingly continued the project that the serpent had begun, calling upon more angels to fall and enlist in the effort to overthrow the demiurge by force. They believed the original deception of the serpent, that the creator of this physical world is a finite being. Not only a finite being, but an actively hostile and malevolent finite being who had to be escaped from. They were trying to find a way to break out of the prison of this physical reality or die trying on the very principle of justice. Their efforts to overthrow God and escape His prison of matter were primarily expressed by dissolving the divisions within the created order, attempting to undermine the structural integrity of its logos, because they knew that it was by divisions that God created this world. While the rebellion was crushed in the Great Flood, and humanity only survived as a single family of loyalists, witnessing this cataclysmic horror tempted certain members of the family into resenting the great big bully in the sky. As a result, one of the children castrated God's high priest, his father, took the priest's wife, his mother, and enslaved his brothers. Then, leaving the sole father, priest, and loyalist impotent, the rest of humanity took off to a distant land and attempted to rebuild the pre-flood world in as far as they were able. God shortened their lifespans and increased their vulnerability to bodily harm in each successive generation, hoping to cause the memory of this cancerous idea to be forgotten. However, their fathers, still living a few hundred years, devised a religious system to cause themselves to be worshipped as gods, in order to preserve the memory and creed of rebelling against the priest of the Creator God. This system of worshipping history's great rebellion kept the people allied with demons through the powers of sorcery and divination. Not like the impotent fortune-telling and levitation that can be done by occultists today, but witchcraft on the order of the magicians in Pharaoh's court. Even as the generations of uneducated Gentiles came and went, serving their gods of gold and silver, wood and stone, mostly unaware of the inherited drama that preceded them, they knew better than to defy the gods who enslaved them, for they saw their great power over nature in regular, irrefutable demonstrations. That is, until the Incarnation, when the restrainer was put into place. The free fall of humanity's fever dream was finally reconciled to the mind of God when its creator united the divine nature and human nature by entering the world as one of us. At the very moment of his birth, the powers of sorcery no longer had the potency which they received from holding captive the old Adam's mind. Now that the new Adam became the ground of the mind of creation, The powers of sorcery were limited only to what they could drum up through human devotion alone. By comparison, very pathetic. As the serpent lost the power to rule over the world in the guise of the old gods, he reintroduced the original heresy into the followers of Christ, claiming that Christ was not sent from the God who created the physical world, but instead from the hypothesized source above, with the mission of continuing the violent prison break. In the passage of time, however, the Christ of the Catholics crushed under heel the Christ of the Gnostics, and the world was in the process of healing for a time. However, since the redemption of the body is not yet, the disease of psychosis still exists within the flesh. From the flesh, the disease of death caused divisions within the church and rendered her incapable of fully redeeming the world. We come now to the present age, where we await a time when the restrainer will be removed, and the world will fall once again into the practices of sorcery and idolatry with the conscious knowledge of rebellion against the Creator. Understanding the ethos behind the battle between good and evil can help to give us the right expectation when discerning more precise details about the apocalypse. Without context, we might be at the risk of reading into the future biases from the niche issues related to our own era. However, our era of ignorance about this conflict is an anomaly. The true norm, the true baseline, is to frame a great unveiling in terms of the total arc of this war with God. Only someone born in the past 500 years out of all history could possibly expect the apocalypse to revolve around anything like a counterfeit Christianity. To have this view requires believing, as an axiom of reality, that the serpent must work within the frame of Creator God loyalists in order to persuade even the faithful, that the powers of sorcery and idolatry will always be hollow party tricks, and that only a very few reprobate souls could ever explicitly advocate for undiluted Satanism. These presuppositions are simply ahistorical, and exactly none of the scriptures or tradition address conditions that remotely resemble these limitations. That is, aside from novel traditions invented within the past few hundred years that hijack and distort the patristic consensus on the events of the end. One more time, for a summary of the ethos of the end of days. When the revelation of God's existence becomes obvious to all of humanity, at the beginning of these final 40-ish years, we will see a final and explicit reversion to the normal manifestation of rebellion against God. Due to our normalcy bias of living in a world where virtually everyone is confused and ignorant of basic truths, it can be difficult to imagine why a fully conscious rebellion against God would be the prime contender for the Antichrist doctrine. However, with this scenario, we get the benefit of claiming all of the New Testament descriptions of Antichrist and the Antichrist spirit at face value. The deception will be, in the end, exactly as it was in the beginning. Characteristic of the apocalypse, or unveiling, the naked truth will be evident to all, and presenting a binary choice to all inhabitants of the earth. We also have the added benefit of making perfect sense of the language in John's apocalypse without allegorizing it into nonsense. When John says that God brings these plagues for humanity's practice of sorcery and idolatry, that's exactly what it means. Likewise, when it says that they blasphemed the God of heaven and refused to repent when they were afflicted with his judgments, it, once again, means exactly what it says. Reducing blasphemy, sorcery, and idolatry to something like ecumenism, for example, is a radical offense to God's justice. To act as if believing in the filioque and papal supremacy is in any way equal to blasphemy, sorcery, and idolatry only shows either a profound desperation to cling to absurd first principles in other areas, or a demonic thirst to condemn as many other people as possible in order to inflate one's own sense of righteousness. I suppose that the final stronghold of criticism for someone with a modernist bias on the apocalypse will be the language of some kind of deception, being one of the many characteristics of the Antichrist and the sentiment he embodies. People today grow up in such a luxurious wealth of sincere desire to be faithful to the Creator God that they assume the deception has to work within that framework to be a deception at all. However, this isn't the way that the scriptures or the pre-modern fathers use the term. The serpent is described as deceiving Eve. This isn't suggesting that Eve thought eating the fruit was the will of God. It simply means that she was convinced of something else. Being the Antichrist doesn't necessitate that it will be a partially warped version of sincere belief in Christ. Outright hatred of Christ, when deceived into thinking it's justified, is still a deception, and it's still equally as much of an instead of Christ. Now, back to the question that began this whole discussion. How can it be that the very same people, alive and witnessing the coming of the Son of Man in the heavens, the witnesses of the coming of Elijah, and the worldwide exaltation of Orthodox Christianity, choose to abandon Christ and consciously defy him instead? One of the characteristic traits of Gnosticism is a moral criticism of God, based on his apparent injustice or crude methods in executing justice. It isn't fundamentally about which God is the most powerful, although the masses with little conviction will surely follow the Antichrist for that reason too. The original deception was that God is not good. The serpent told Eve that if God is withholding divine knowledge from her, he must not be a good God. Likewise, with the civilization preceding the flood, if God kicked us out of paradise for simply wanting not to be ignorant, he must not be a good God. The tower, too. If God flooded the world and all its inhabitants simply because they wouldn't bow the knee, he must be a petty tyrant. So too, when the restrainer is removed and people begin to experiment with the kind of sorcery that hasn't been seen since before the Incarnation, it might be hard to watch God inflict torturous sufferings upon them, especially if it's your sister, your daughter, or your friend, and there's zero ambiguity about who's causing it and why. Lots of people will want to be loyal to Christ, but when loved ones are taking the wrong side of the divide and getting severely punished for it, then that conviction is going to get seriously tested. This is why the fathers say that predicting the apocalypse has nothing to do with surviving it. The only thing that can actually prepare a person is genuine spiritual growth. When the forces of demonic influence stir up a frenzy of passion within a mob of people, only those who have had real exercise and practice going against popular sentiment will be able to stand. When the trumpets turn the entire created order into a waking nightmare of death and decay, only someone whose stress tolerance has been practiced will keep a clear head. When a Christian sees their friend who hasn't had the seal of chrismation from the church being tortured by demons for months without even being allowed the mercy of death, they might be tempted to feel resentment toward God too, unless they've had to endure God allowing personal tragedy in their life before. Going further, I find it likely that this will be the outpouring of the gift of clairvoyance on, if not all of humanity, a distinct majority. Joel 2's description of universal prophetic gifts on the Christians applies even more so to the end of days than it did to its fulfillment at Pentecost. And with full-on sorcery on the other side, they'll surely be able to use oracles, soothsaying, and divination to possess something comparable to clear sight. If that's the case, there's another test of character to be shown. How does one react when all sins and secrets are exposed and laid bare to the public? Do you own it with humility, or do you lash out in shame? Cheap talk will be revealed as cheap, and true virtue, built in secret, will also be uncovered. All this restlessness, resentment, and frenzy will be channeled into one champion, someone who can lead the oppressed humanity in a war against a big bad demiurge. Someone who can overthrow the God of heaven and break them out of the matrix, or die trying. While this jailbreak mission is certainly a strong delusion, there are no tricks, no bait and switch. It's just an apocalypse and the consummation of the conflict between good and evil, with no more masks or veils of ignorance. It really is simply the unveiling. Now, where do all of the elements actually fit on a timeline? What does this look like in detail, play by play? We'll answer that in part 2 of this video about Antichrist in the end. I hope we're all ready.